Hi, I'm Zoe, and this week we're going to be talking about the vegan and vegetarian movements, specifically the views that college students have on them. Who eats meat, and how and why, and investigating the issues of animal rights as well as personal preference. These are the interviews of 5 Johnston students.
At the University of Redlands.
Now we're talking to Kobe, a junior at Johnston.
So I'm a vegetarian, and for me personally, it's because of factory farming and how animals are raised and produced, and how they're produced, and meat is produced today, with our modern society, if you will. But I don't necessarily have an ethical grounding for just eating meat in general. So if it was hunted, I'd have a different story for you.
What would you say are the top 3 issues with a factory farming system?
Probably CO2 emissions, waste and pollution, and last would probably be it's a very fertile place for like superbugs and producing
what?
Superbugs, like producing.
So disease.
Yes.
Okay.
That's a good one too.
Got it. All right. And so for you, where would the animal rights argument come into that? Is that on another place in the list, or how does that factor into your thoughts?
Yeah. That's an interesting topic because a lot of it can be very subjective. You're projecting human emotions, human experience on animals that are not fundamentally just like us, even though they may have a lot of similarities. So that's a tough one for me, the ethics of animals and like quantifying suffering for animals. But the concentration of animals as they are raised now, the conditions in terms of like how enclosed they are, how much space they have, access to the outdoors, food that they consume, those would be concerns for me, because I do feel like they have the capacity for suffering, and it's something that I, especially as someone who's interested in Buddhism and that kind of thing, is a grounding for me in how I relate to others. And so, but the subjectivity of the topic is challenging for me.
Yeah.
To really give you
right.
a solid opinion on it. Yeah.
Definitely. So quickly, what do you think a Buddhist philosophy applied to factory farming and the ethics of it would look like?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, nonviolence is a big part of Buddhism, as well as some philosophical concepts, one being interdependence. Interdependence is how you conceptualize, through a Buddhist lens, relationships with others. And so we're essentially reflections of each other. We're all kind of a part of one another and connected to one another. So in that sense, the well-being of others is inextricably tied to the well-being of oneself. And so seeing any plight that may become happening to the animals that sustain us would be our natural response would be to alleviate that, because they're inextricably a part of our well-being, and we are inextricably a part of their well-being, as is the foundation of interconnection.
What do you think the main obstacles to changing your diet, eating less animal products than other people are?
An interesting perspective I'd like to take is one I got from a class called Food and Nature. I took it here at the university freshman year, and what they were talking about is how the USDA has its own economic incentives for advertising and promoting meat, and how that can then be reflected in how they present the information of like nutrients. And so meat can be like thought of as the only protein source, and so people will think, oh, I can't be a vegetarian, I can't be a vegan because I need protein which is only from this source. So it's like this interesting, almost like political undertone that is manipulating how we engage with and understand ourselves and our worlds. Yeah, food is inextricably a part of our cultures as well, meat being a big part of that. In other cultures, I think especially, it's like Argentina, beef is a big part of their culture. And so I think it can often cause rifts in people's relationships because they may not understand why you're not eating meats. They may be offended because it has cultural roots.
Gender could be a factor in who chooses to produce their animal products and how within our society.
Oh, shoot. I don't think I've thought of that before.
Yeah?
I guess the biggest one is the conception of a man as being macho, and so to be macho is to be muscular. To be muscular is to eat protein. So men would, to answer that question, I think men would be the most the most likely to consume meat because they have the standard of themselves as being very muscular and strong, which, as I said, protein comes from meat. Yeah.
For sure. Cool. How do you think socioeconomic status would factor in?
Ooh. Well, I know that corn is subsidized by the government, so and that is used to for a lot of products, but one in particular is meat, sold in McDonald's and other fast food restaurants. So you can get a Big Mac very cheaply. So and then very abundant, McDonald's, whereas more ethically grounded companies that produce meat are probably more expensive and less available to many people, both in geographically and financially. So I imagine that given that context, it would be easier for people who have a financial budget and financial restrictions to buy those meals.
Right. I think age would factor in.
Well, if you're going back to concerns for nutrients, particularly protein, I imagine that youth, the ages of teenagers to 30-year-olds are probably in their prime and are thinking about their physical abilities, and so they'd probably be eating more meats. Whereas people, I think we have a particular interesting conception of ourselves in terms of age in our culture, and very sensitive to our age. Probably more conscious of how much meat and then fat content they're taking in. Especially when you get older, there's less metabolism and ability to
Why do you think people would be more conscious of meat and fat intake?
Having fat.
Right.
I even find myself pinching myself to see if I have fat, even though I'm a super skinny dude. So those beauty standards are, I think, very pervasive. And so people, probably youth as well, but I think as you get older, just because your metabolism and your ability to kind of process that fat gets slower and less capable, people are going to be more conscious as they're older. Either refrain from or gravitate to certain things that are in line with that conception of what is healthy and what brings a rise to healthiness.
Right.
So if you were to say that meat, because it has a lot of protein, is healthy, then people will be eating meat and protein. That's what I'm thinking. But you're saying that there's a lot of fat content in meat and a lot of sodium content, and that leads to this, and this, and that's why it's bad for health. Then you may see people going towards veggies and lower sodium contents and that thing.
For sure.
So.
I'm Maddie Minchin. I live on 3rd floor Holt. I'm a Johnson student.
What is your intake of animal products right now?
I've been vegetarian my whole life.
Your whole life? Wow. So starting when you were a child?
Yeah. So my parents raised me and my sister vegetarian. My mom became vegetarian when she was 16 in the panhandle of Texas, so that was a little difficult. Yeah. And so she has been ever since, and they decided to raise me and my sister vegetarian. They're now pescatarian, but I was not into that when I was little, so I told them I wasn't down. So she got really, really sick pretty soon after she decided to become vegetarian, because obviously her parents weren't really making anything that she could eat, and so she was just eating iceberg lettuce salad and just crap.
Sad days. Sad
crap.
days.
And so she started eating fish, and she kind of went back and forth for a little while because she ended up in the hospital because she got so anemic. And so then she moved away when she was 17, so she moved to California. So then she was fine. But I still have problems when I go back to Texas about people kind of judging you when you say, like, do you have anything that doesn't have meat in it? Like, they all look at you like you're crazy, which is so strange in this day and age, but they definitely
What do you think is going through their minds?
I don't know. I think, like, people, especially in the Panhandle of Texas, are not very exposed to anything but their own culture. As, like, generalized as that is to say. But, like, that's what I've seen, at least. And so I think that, like, anyone who's remotely different or does anything remotely different from their views or their lifestyle, they just kind of instantly judge it rather than, like, being more interested to learn about it. And meat is such an important part of culture there. Wow. But yeah, they definitely eat meat like every day, all day, every single meal. It's just like a really important thing. So for them to try to like understand what it would be like to not do that, I think it's just hard to grasp.
Yeah.
For me, it's for mostly moral reasons, but also environmental reasons. I mean, I am super obsessed with all those documentaries that talk about all the issues, the environmental issues that, like I said, just the way that animals are treated and grown, and just like it's just so inhumane. It like makes me feel really sick to even imagine it. So so that's kind of my reason. I was also raised that way, but like I definitely have the same views. Like if I wasn't into it, I like wouldn't do that. But that's super important to me. And what I'm doing. It's important for me to not be like a preachy vegetarian. Like people can all make their own decisions about that sort of thing. Like I like to educate my friends when they don't know, but people get really mad when you kind of start talking about that because that's such a sensitive thing. And I feel like so many people know exactly what they're eating and know exactly where it's coming from because they've seen documentaries or they've seen something on the news about what's going on, but they just are not willing to change their lifestyle, which I like is in so many aspects of people's lives, which is frustrating.
How and why do you think that inaction comes when some people are educated by watching the exact same documentary as other people, and some of them radically change their lives and their diets, and others don't?
Yeah. It's not necessarily like a level of passion on one side or the other. Some people just decide to do something and can stick with it forever. But like when you've grown up eating something your whole life and that you really like I can imagine that that's really tough to give up. It's just hard for me to understand because like I would never, like if I found out something awful that I was like consuming in my body and how many ways that like hurts in the environment and other people, I would just like instantly stop. Like it just makes sense to me. But I guess a lot of people don't necessarily think that way. Like I said, selfish. I think our generation is really, really selfish. Well, when you have such like instant gratification in every aspect of your life, it's really easy to be selfish. Those things kind of like influence the way that we view like wanting to change things. And I was explained when I was little what it meant, and I was like horrified that anybody would ever eat an animal.
What do you think the main obstacles to being vegetarian right here and right now are?
I honestly don't think there are very many. So, like, I go to a restaurant and there's, like, one or two things I can have that's on the menu, but that's okay with me. Like, I'm kind of used to that. But, like, for people who haven't ever had that struggle, that might be difficult. But, like, I feel like it's very widely accepted, at least where we live, as so common that, like, I never go to, like, an event and worry that there won't be anything I can eat because everyone is always considering that nowadays.
How do you think gender factors in who decides to reduce their consumption of animal products and how?
I don't know if I think that gender factors in, honestly. I think maybe it would be a little bit more looked down upon for like a traditionally male, masculine appearing person to instantly become like vegetarian or vegan. But if you think about it, like a lot of male bodybuilders are actually like raw vegan diet.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So
how do you think socioeconomic factors in to that same question?
Yeah, well that's kind of an obvious one. I mean, like fast food is like very readily available, whereas fresh, healthy food is not. So it's much easier to eat fast food, which means meat usually, and it costs a lot less when you don't have the education to know where these things are coming from and how they're affecting a lot of other things that rather than just the animal's life. Then maybe you won't even have like the moral obligation to do so.
How do you think age factors in? Especially from the perspective of someone who's been vegetarian since a very young age.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I have a an aunt who lives in the Panhandle of Texas, and she would eat fast food all day, every day for her whole life and developed diabetes. And then in the last couple of years became like vegan and almost completely gluten-free, and is so happy and like so into it. And so she found that at a very late age and is all about it, and like that's not very common where she lives. And so I think that's super cool. And then I've also like met little kids who found out that, like what meat meant, and they like instantly like, I'm never eating that again, and they don't. So yeah, it's all just about like your mindset around the topic. I don't necessarily think that age defines that, though.
How do you think a person's health status would factor into their decision to reduce animal products?
Yeah, well, I know a lot of people who've had health issues. I mean, there's a lot of research that's being done and has been done about the effect of a vegetarian diet on your health. It's a lot healthier when you're like intaking all that meat, especially like red meats and stuff. Like, it's not good for you and your heart. So, and I think a lot of people are starting to realize that. So it's kind of becoming more of a health fad and like popularity thing, which is fine with me. Like, whatever gets people to stop eating meat, I don't really care. Yeah.
Right. Hey, I'm Lucas Poppel. I'm a Johnston student, so sophomore. Yeah. I try to reduce my meat consumption generally, but I also just am someone who's an omnivore. I'm blessed in lack of dietary restrictions.
From this perspective, why do you think people who do choose to reduce or eliminate their intake of animal products, why did they do that?
I guess it either tends to have to do with some kind of logistical viewpoint or some kind of morality viewpoint. Like, either someone is doing it because eating animal products is inefficient or like bad for the environment, or they're doing it because they think that eating animals is immoral.
How do you think gender factors into a decision like this?
I think a lot of feminism and feminist critique often focuses around how things are implemented in the real in terms of for different groups who are more or less advantaged, necessarily because of how feminism is structured. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that there's a lot more consideration of like, if we like have a vegan movement, then who is affected like poorly economically, or who is disadvantaged by such a movement or advantaged by such a movement in terms of like distribution or location or I guess culture as well. And I think, I guess gender-wise, it seems like those with less privilege are more likely to consider such questions, just because their internal philosophy and internal world is based a lot more around like questions of privilege and questions of have and have-nots. Men have a lot of privilege.
Okay. And so you think they would be less likely to consider these questions and then less likely to reduce their intake of animal products?
Yeah, I think so.
How do you think socioeconomic status is a factor?
I think that so first, there is like a weird nouveau movement in like the lives of rich people or richer people, wherein it's chic to like go to Whole Foods, as it were, or like buy food that's like natural and wholesome and organic. And that's like...
There were air quotes there.
Yeah, there were air quotes, sorry. And I guess that is like totally inaccessible to most people, regardless of like whether or not it's a good thing, which it probably is to some degree. And so there's like that's like a movement of like going back to like cleanliness or purity of food that's like totally inaccessible to a normal person. So I guess like stuff like veganism or vegetarianism, I don't know, like I am not well versed in like the economics of such a thing. But I would think that it would be more difficult to make a transition from a current system to that, just because it would probably require a lot of self-tailoring of food, and a lot of people who are disadvantaged economically don't have a lot of time, like, because that's essentially what economics is the movement of societal time around an area. So people who work part-time jobs every single day of the week for most of the day just don't have the amount of time to self-tailor things like that without like an extensive societal support system or like a cultural support system, which I don't think are really in place.
If those were to be in place, what do you think they would look like?
Food distribution is omninormative, I guess. I guess the problem is really like economy of scale. Like it's just cheaper and more effective to grow, though, I mean, disregarding what it means for breeding and genetics of like fruit and other things. It's just cheaper to grow or harvest things in the one place where they naturally congregate or are easiest to grow, and then ship them everywhere. It's not like sustainable ecologically, but it makes like a lot of food less expensive. That would be like a problem that would need to be like contended with. But I think otherwise there could just be like a promotion of like vegan product. I think another thing is there are a lot of like really poorly done government subsidies for land that is perfectly fine, like that's just being used to grow corn that we're never going to use or not going to use effectively at all and going to piddle away. So like a lot of those could be retired, and we could establish, I guess, like more vegan-friendly government subsidies in order to encourage people to eat less meat, I guess, or at least change their diets so it's more predisposed towards eating, like, not animal products. Though I think there are a lot of things that are, like, fairly protein efficient that are animal products.
How do you think age is a factor in a decision to reduce or eliminate animal products?
Seems to me that people who are younger tend to be a lot more liberal, and people who are older tend to be a lot more conservative, necessarily, though there are, like, that's, like, not, like, an iron rule. There are a lot of people who are, it doesn't take into account the difference between, like, privileged economic status and, like, so, like, ideas of social change. But if you're younger, you're probably more likely to be vegan. But I feel like there are a lot of people who probably are vegan for whatever reason who are not, like, young. But I feel, but I just feel instinctively like there are a larger group of people who are vegan who are younger.
Cool. How do you think a person's health status affects their decision to reduce or eliminate animal products?
Okay, well, obviously, if you need to be a dietary vegan, then it's pretty easy to be a vegan because you have to. Not much to say about that. I guess there are a lot of people for whom dietary restrictions make it really difficult to be more vegan, I suppose, or make it difficult to not be vegan.
You mentioned.
I don't care so much for. I said at the beginning that people either make moral arguments for for like veganism or vegetarianism, or they make like efficiency arguments. I think people make moral arguments too much because there's no way that you're going to, like, regardless of whether or not you hold it for a moral reason, you're not going to convince people for a moral reason if they just don't agree with you, because morality is, like, arbitrary, and most people, like, try and make it arguable, but in the end, if someone just says, I just don't want to only eat blank, then there's, like, what can you say? Like, nothing. Yeah. So it's better if you make efficiency arguments and draw people in that way, because then they're open to the idea that they're wrong for a reason that doesn't relate to, like, their arbitrary conception of how the world should work.
My name is Hope. I'm a sophomore at the University of Redlands, and I'm a Johnston student. And I've been a vegan for about 2.5 years.
Awesome. So what's your background with the animal rights movement?
Well, I think that social justice is something that has been an area of interest for me for a long time. And it began with animal rights for me when I was around 10 or 11 years old. I started with looking at the food industry and the things we consume when I developed, like, more of a consciousness as to where, like, just the idea that what we were consuming was once, like, alive. And I think that reality and that truth started to resonate with me as I became more mature. So I started doing a lot of research online, and I learned about slaughterhouses and factory farming and the unimaginable abuse that animals endure at those places. And so when I was about 12 years old, I became a vegetarian. And then I've been vegetarian up until, I think, end of my junior year of high school, I want to say. And then I became a vegan. That was kind of like a gateway social justice issue into all sorts of other things, like other issues that animals face, like in terms of animal testing and fur farms, the entertainment industry, biomedical research. And then from there, of course, you can't think about animal rights without thinking about the environment. And so it's played a huge part in me coming into my, like, awakening of social consciousness.
So would you tell parents to watch out for their kids because going vegan is a gateway social issue?
I think that for a lot of kids, you hear about a lot of like young teenagers, saying that they're vegetarian, saying that they don't want to eat meat because it is such a prevalent like reality that we live every day. And when kids come to that realization, I think that it begins as a very innocent, just desire to do less harm. And because I think that kids and younger people are less affected by the social conditioning of our culture just because they've existed for less amount of time. And so they're more likely to, take a stand against some of the things that are the accepted norms because they've had less time for it to be ingrained in their life as the accepted norm.
What reasons do you think people have for reducing or eliminating their intake of animal products? Other people that you've observed and talked to?
I think that people who do abstain from consuming animal products or eating less animal products do it for a variety of reasons. I know people who do it for reasons of health because there's overwhelming research that the consumption of large amounts of animal products can, especially with people who have predisposed genetic potentials for certain diseases like diabetes and obesity, to consume less animal products is a really good way to ensure that you'll have just a healthier being overall. In addition to that, there are people who are very into the environmental movement and who don't consume animal products because factory farming is the leading cause of climate change, even ahead of vehicles in this country. And so to be immersed in the environmental movement, you really can't be genuinely immersed in that without at least an awareness of the impacts of factory farming. So I think a lot of environmentalists are vegetarian or vegan.
Yeah, I last time I looked at it, it was a greater impact than all transportation combined.
Right, yeah. I think that sounds about right. I think I've read that somewhere as well. And then, of course, in addition to that, there's just the people who are immersed in the animal rights movement. And, of course, if you believe that animals have basic rights, which is the right to a life free of suffering, of course you're going to be vegan. I think even more, I think that that's an important distinction to make between vegetarianism and veganism because you have to acknowledge the interconnectedness that the dairy and the egg industry has with factory farming. And so people who are behind the animal rights movement are often vegan for that reason.
What are your personal reasons for being vegan?
Well, like I said, like the way that I learned about it was through the lens of animal rights when I was younger. And so that's definitely a principal reason for me. I think that definitely respecting our place in the natural world and some level of humility that comes with being in this world comes with less entitlement to consume animals just because we can. And I think that another important distinction that needs to be made is the fact that, especially in terms of first world factory farming, we consume animal products not because we need to, but because we can. And I think that that is one of the many marks of arrogance that we have in this world as humans and as what we consider to be the dominant species. So I think that if we live in a world where we are able to survive without causing harm to other beings and without using them for our consumption, and we are fully capable of that, our bodies are fully adapted and capable of that, why shouldn't we? So that's probably what I would consider to be my main reason, along with learning about environmental factors, as well as I care a lot about my health, and I know that as an athlete, I think that it's what works well for me as well. So
awesome. And just so everyone else knows, what are your greatest athletic achievements?
I'm a runner, so that's my primary place where I consider myself an athlete. I ran cross country. I played other sports earlier on, but just as a runner, which I consider to be a pretty physically demanding sport. Yeah, that's what I do.
Okay. I was looking for you to say that you ran 2 marathons while you're being vegan.
I ran one just before I went vegan, and then I ran the other one after being a vegan for about a year. And so, yeah, that's definitely, when I tell people that I'm vegan, that's definitely something that I'll tell them because there's a common misconception that people who are vegan are weaker, aren't getting the right nutrients, aren't, that the only source of like strength is, you know, meat, red meat, things that are typically considered masculine foods, I would say, which is an interesting take on it as well.
Yeah.
So that's something that I really want to try to deconstruct and make people think, even for a second, that like it is possible to achieve a lot of things that are considered difficult athletic achievements without the use of animal products. And I was fine. Like, I did great, and I felt sore, but I was fine afterwards, just like everybody else.
Were there any specific hardships you think that came with running the marathon because you're vegan?
The greatest hardship that I faced was talking to other people and hearing about everyone else thinking that I was going to be very, very seriously hurt from trying to do this. And hearing that constantly made me a little bit scared at times, because I heard a lot more of that as a vegan my second time running than as a vegetarian. People weren't as like concerned for me when I was a vegetarian when I ran my first marathon, and then the next year I was vegan, and they were all very concerned, and they all thought that I was going to hurt myself and that I was going to collapse, or that I was not going to have enough calories to burn, or I didn't have enough protein in me, or whatever it was. And so I was scared sometimes about that, but once I did it, I felt so like a lot of, in addition to like feeling pride for the physical achievement, I felt really good to come back to all those people and be like, look, I'm fine. Like, you were worried for nothing, you know?
What would you say the main obstacles are of being vegan in general?
Just like the social obstacles is definitely a huge thing. Constantly having to be, most of the time, one of the only vegans in like a social group of people when you're together, when you go out to eat. That's definitely an obstacle. Living just in a non-vegan world is difficult at times when there are places where there's one thing on the menu. I think socially is the biggest aspect. And with that also, there comes with some sort of intentionality with making sure that you do get enough nutrients and you do get enough of everything that you need. But I would argue that anybody who's trying to be intentional about their health needs to do that, whether you're vegan or not. And so even if you are okay with consuming all animal products, that doesn't mean that you're getting enough nutrients. And yet yet nobody's really on your case constantly about getting enough, whatever it is. And yet you're probably deficient in so many things, because especially if you're consuming meat in the way we typically do in the Western world, in the United States. It's not a healthy way of living. It's very doable. It's not, being vegan itself is not hard. It's not a hard thing to do. And if our world was more adapted to it, it would be very easy and better for everyone. Like I said before, there are certain foods that I think are associated with masculinity. You know, steak, very high amounts of red meat, things like that, for whatever reason, are associated with masculinity and strength and things like that. And I think that as a woman, I didn't have to deal with as strong of a stigma abstaining from those products, because the expectation of masculinity for me is not as strong as somebody who identifies as a male. And just on average, there are many more female vegetarians and vegans than men. And I think that also has to do with, in addition to expectations of masculinity, a greater capacity for it to be socially acceptable for women to be sensitive and to be compassionate toward others. And men may have a greater effort to kind of not think too much about where their food comes from, or to play it off or make jokes about it, because if they're not doing that, then they're going to have to actually acknowledge what they're contributing to is evil. And then if they have to acknowledge that, they have to show compassion and sensitivity, which is not something that is okay for them to do. Right. So, yeah.
Just out of curiosity, why do you think steak has been selected as like the masculine food, or other foods like it? Like, why does that mean masculinity?
That's a good question. I would say, maybe it's because steak is a red meat, and so red meat, I don't know, animals who are typically, first of all, mammals, so closer to us, so the domination of other beasts. I I guess, I don't know, red meat coming from cows and things like that. They're larger animals that evolved from other animals that required much more effort to subdue and to hunt. They evolved from, I don't want to get this wrong and say the exact species that they evolved from, but I feel like back when we were in times and places where we would hunt animals, they have similar features of animals like buffalo and creatures like that, in which to bring home a large animal of that nature was a mark of pride and a mark of dominance and achievement for the men, because of course the men were the hunters. So maybe that mentality and that social construct has kind of evolved to this day. And of course it manifests itself in different ways, because the people who consume the red meat are very rarely the people who are killing it in the factory farms. So I think that in a weird way that mentality has translated today. But of course it's so far removed and yet still existent, which is interesting to me.
How do you think socioeconomic status factors into this decision?
One of the dominant mentalities today is that it's too expensive to be vegan. And I do think that there is some truth in that. To buy, $6 to buy a salad, but you go to McDonald's, it's like $2 for a Big Mac. Like, what are you gonna do if you have, limited income and every day you have to worry about how you're gonna feed your family and you're making money below the poverty line? Of course, you're gonna choose the Big Mac because that is more nutrients. It'll make you fuller. May not be healthier for you, but overall, it seems like it's more food than consuming a salad. So I think to some extent that's true, but at the same time, I have read about people who are of lower socioeconomic status, and in fact, there's a subculture, I'm going to call it a subculture of people who are of lower socioeconomic status, a lot of people of color who are embracing veganism and are showing people that it's possible and they can do it. You just have to know how to do it and to look in the right places. So in addition to that, I think that there's also, different social constructs and social levels of social acceptability of being vegan, and I think that it's much more acceptable to be richer and to be vegan than to be poor. So for some reason, it seems like it's much more of an anomaly for a poorer person to be vegan.
How do you think age is a factor in this decision?
Well, I think just like a lot of other social issues, our generation, the millennial generation, is more apt to be open and responsive to realities that they learn about. And I think a lot of that has to do with social media and just the way that we transfer and process information is very different from our parents and our grandparents. And so I think that there is going, with each generation, I think that there's going to be more vegetarians and vegans, primarily out of just popularity for social movements to kind of permeate through the internet and things like that. And also, sadly, out of necessity, because that's going to be one of the ways in which we, I think, are going to have to deal with other issues like climate change and things like that. To abstain from animal products is one of the biggest ways we can collectively reduce our carbon footprint.
How do you think an individual's health status affects the decision to reduce or eliminate animal products?
Oh, I think that it's a huge factor. I think that's one of the biggest factors. I hear all the time people saying, I need to consume meat because I don't get enough XYZ into me. And so the only way for me to do this is for me to consume meat. I need to have a really high level of iron, so I need to consume a lot of red meat. I hear that all the time. And I am never going to look at someone and be like, that's not true. But at the same time, I think that the fact that you do need more iron, that the immediate instinctive result is to be dependent on meat, I think that is a result of the information that we are fed by people who have an agenda. And I think that it's absolutely possible for anybody to be vegan. I don't think that there's somebody who absolutely has to be dependent on animal products, because to me that doesn't make sense, because everything that an animal product contains is contained in the food that animal consumed. It's just eliminating one step, and you may have to eat more of it. There may have to be a way higher level of intentionality. And if that's not something that you're in a position to do, that's one thing. But it's not because you're physically incapable of being a vegan. I don't think that that's a thing, honestly.
Who are the people feeding us this information?
I think that the people and the companies and the groups who are feeding us this are people who have stake in factory farming and, yes, steak, but like the other kind of steak spelled differently. But yeah, I think that the USDA has something invested in it. Sadly, there's so much corruption going on with the USDA. Almost all of the commercials we see for food are animal products or processed foods. Like, when was the last time you saw a commercial for kale? Never. You never see a commercial for kale, but you constantly see a commercial for Big Macs, for these very highly processed foods. So I think that when we live in the world of industrialized capitalism, like, it's going to obviously be like a permeated mentality, but I think it has a lot of sources.
Yeah, that sounds so strange to me, to have a commercial for kale. I can't even imagine what that would look like,
Exactly, yeah. I think that the health, I think that my opinion on, like, people, like, someone's health status is a huge factor. And I think that's one of my most controversial opinions. I think that most people would disagree with me on that, because that's something that is very personal, and I don't want to ever be one to attack someone's personal relationship with food, because I think it's such an intimate thing. Yeah, one thing I do think is important to talk about is the difference between some of the ways that the vegan movements are perceived by other people and by the media versus what it actually means to be a vegan. And I hope that people would, when they think about veganism, will think of things beyond PETA, who have the right idea but take some of the worst approaches to a movement that doesn't have a whole lot of voice, and so often they become the sole representation of such an important movement. So I think that I would love for people to acknowledge and to be aware that there are so many vegans out there who don't have the attitude and who don't have the attitude of PETA, and who aren't gonna be in your face and call you out for being a horrible person for eating meat, because you're not. You're not a horrible person if you eat meat. There are people who just simply want to share information and who want to talk to you. I hope that next time you talk to somebody who doesn't eat animal products, you are able to maybe try to put your biases aside for like just a minute and hear what they have to say and hear what their experience is, instead of being defensive.
I'm Claire Stewart. I'm a Johnson student. I'm a sophomore. I also swim.
Oh. So would you mind telling me what you're eating right now?
Some beef jerky right now.
Awesome.
I'm chewing it.
Would you consider yourself an omnivore?
Yes, definitely.
So looking at the vegan and vegetarian movements, why do you think people choose to reduce or eliminate animal products?
Honestly, any kind of farming industry is, they treat the animals really shitty. I mean, there's just terrible living conditions. The animals don't, live the duration of their lives. They get killed really young. I would not want to be an animal getting ready to be slaughtered. I think that especially in the United States, there's a huge culture of meat eating. And so oftentimes, not only is it people are looked at strangely for being vegetarian or vegan, but also there's just not as much of an option in a lot of restaurants or especially eating out, I think would be one of the main things.
For sure. How do you think gender factors into a decision to reduce or eliminate animal products in someone's diet?
That's a cool question. So I think that, again, in the United States, it's really manly, I'm gonna go eat some beef jerky, wow, I'm eating beef jerky, or some steak, I just need a burger kind of thing. I think a lot of times guys will do that because it's looked at as a masculine thing to eat red meat, which is so weird, but definitely.
Why do you think that is?
I think it might honestly go back to women being the gatherers and men being the hunters, and oh, I'm gonna go out and kill a deer now, I think that might be what it's about. Meat is definitely more expensive, but I don't honestly know if it really, if people of lower classes in this country eat less meat. I'm not sure. I'd have to have more information. I actually don't, from what I've seen in my life, I don't think that socioeconomic class really dictates like the levels of meat that are consumed. Maybe like the quality of meat, but I don't know about like the amounts.
For sure. To what extent do you think age is a factor?
Well, I think our generation is definitely deviating from eating meat much more than like our parents' generations. Like, especially, I know my dad's a baby boomer, and like he was brought up like eating meat at every meal, which is like, you don't need that. I don't need that. I don't do that. But
how often do you eat meat?
I probably eat meat. I mean, I eat meat a lot more at school than I did at home, just because there's like not a lot of options. But like if I were to like have a choice, I'd probably eat it like once a day, like at the most. Like I really don't eat that much at home, but like here I eat a lot more. Generationally, I think that definitely our generation and like generations after us will be consuming a lot less meat, just because we're more aware of like you know, the harm that does to the animals, the harm that does to the planet. But in general, I think older people definitely eat a lot more meat than we do.
All right. To what extent do you think an individual's health status is a factor in the decision to reduce or eliminate animal products?
My worry about becoming a vegetarian, it would be that I'm not getting enough protein because I'm an athlete. And, like, I'd love to be able to do something like that. And I totally could, because I could eat, like, a lot of beans and nuts and stuff. But I honestly just, like, get cravings for meat. Like, just, like, the iron and the fat and stuff. So I think that, like, people's health definitely comes into play, especially if you have, like, a pretty active lifestyle. I think a lot of athletes choose to eat meat because of that.